I can't fry meat in butter. I can't. I absolutely
Oh, you
can't.
don't. You
I
only do,
can't.
you
I
only
do.
do
Goes against your
My religious
energy.
upbringing.
Yes, you only do the shallots in butter, and
I
then you
can't.
do
Doesn't matter.
the hamburger with a pan and some salt on the bottom.
But I also can't eat
Cheeseburgers,
cheeseburger. Cannot do this.
So a bacon cheeseburger is really over the top.
Bacon I can eat on the paper, but not cheese. Not, can't mix with flavors. Can't do it. Isn't that funny? The holdovers. I
Yep.
can make pork chops in my house. But I think to myself,
You'd be very happy in Spain. They love.
they love.
I was in Spain one time.
Ham in Spain, all kinds of ham.
Yes, but I ate calamari the whole time I was in Spain.
Calamari is
Oh
good.
God, it was so good.
Well, last August, we were in Italy. And also we were in Belgium. And it was high season for mussels, so we had mussels everywhere.
Mussels are wonderful. Except I can't eat them. I can't eat any seafood anymore. The shrimp, I'm assuming it's all seafood. But 3 different times I ate shrimp 3 different ways. I was up all night. So I
I
decided.
know what bothers you.
So I decided if it's shrimp, I'm afraid of mussels, I'm afraid of lobster. So,
Crustaceans and mollusks.
yes. Yeah, but you were gone for a long time last summer.
Oh, we're gonna be going longer this time.
Oh, where are you off to?
No,
I'm gonna ask you to open that, sweetheart, I can't get
we
it.
are off to Africa. And then first to the Netherlands, then to Africa, then back to the Netherlands.
Where in Africa?
South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe.
The animals
In Cape Town.
around them.
What are you eating?
Yeah, chicken wings.
Oh, chicken wings are good.
If you ate at 4:45, aren't you gonna need another dinner?
Thank you.
Would you like a chicken wing?
No, thank
You
you.
can dip the chicken in dairy.
I know, but that's good. Chicken.
It's just burgers.
Hi. Isn't that the funniest thing? I just can't do it. Chipotle.
Huh?
I said Chipotle.
Yeah, you didn't bring your dinner?
I ate it early. I was so hungry. I
taste that
didn't-
pizza. Okay, that's easy. Help yourself. No, wait.
Did you go for your walk this morning, Shelley? In this beautiful weather?
No, I wish I could have. I went to get my license renewed. Oh, God, 2 hours I was there. It's incredible.
That's it?
That's it.
Where did you go?
To get my license
Oh, did you have to take a test and
every year,
everything?
no, I just have to have an eye test and driver's test. That's it,
A written or a driven?
just driving. That's all they do now. And they also have a
Recording in progress. Okay. So, fun. On Saturday, which feels like forever ago, we really did some poetic analysis, looking at some psalms that we are already familiar with. So Psalm 23 from most funeral and mourning rituals, and Psalm 27 from the preparation for the high holidays. Shelley, you're looking for a pen? We've got pens. Oh,
thank you.
okay. And we did a little bit of introduction to what Psalms are, where they come from, all of that, but thanks to Phyllis, I realized that I didn't really introduce them well enough.
Because I didn't understand what she was talking.
So I also want to say, if there's ever a moment that you have no clue what the words that come out of my mouth mean, probably I don't know either, and I'm just making things up. But I also really like questions, so ask all the questions, even if it gets us completely off topic. So just basic, what is a psalm? It's a biblical poem. And Psalms have their own book in the Hebrew Bible. In the book of writings, which is the last third of the Hebrew Bible, starts with Torah, then goes to the book of prophets, and then goes to the book of writings, which includes Psalms, Proverbs, the book of Ruth, the book of Esther, Ecclesiastes, the book of Jonah and Job.
Esther is,
Anything that's called a Megillah is from writings.
okay.
So we're most familiar with Esther being called a Megillah.
Right.
And there's 150 Psalms. Very nice round number. Most of them are attributed to King David, who was about 1000 BCE, yeah, give or take. But we don't actually know the author. We just have that most of them begin with something like Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm for David, by David, about David, unclear. And we use Psalms a lot in our liturgy and our rituals now. You know more Psalms than you think you do because you know what prayers we do. And actually, we'll get to some of the ones that you might be familiar with in a little bit. Yes.
So if it's a poem, and I can't remember the word, I may need some help.
The rhythm of a poem. Oh, pandemic or iambic or.
Right, the iambic.
The
Pentameter?
meter,
So the
Right, the
meter is the
meter.
rhythm,
So
iambic
do-
pentameter is the
Everything
thing on and off and.
okay.
Very good. So do the Psalms reflect the meters or the
Sort of.
iambic pentameters?
In Hebrew, there's certainly a rhythm to the words that gets lost in translation. There are a lot of translations, and different translators try to lift up different parts of the text, whether it's the rhythm or the wordplay or the intertextual quoting or whatever it is. So some of it gets lost, but that's not really what biblical poetry cares most about. The wordplay and the intertextual, bringing in other sources. I used to have a professor who called a lot of our prayers tapestry prayers because you weave through a lot of different threads in order to make a more beautiful whole. A lot of poems work like that in the Bible. We know some non-psalm biblical poetry because we know Mi Chamocha, which is its own poem that comes straight out of Torah. We know, what are some other poems? The priestly blessing counts as a biblical poem. Usually they're laid out.
Songs is poetic.
Right, the Song of Songs is its own epic poem, an entire book.
It's a love wave
It
of sorts.
right, I would call it like the very first version of erotic poetry. It can get very graphic, but it's also supposedly written by Solomon and becomes a love poem from God to God's chosen people. So think about all the different versions of love there are out there, shows up in Song of Songs. But for the most part, we use Psalms now not just as poetry, of which there's many different forms of poetry that show up in our rituals, but as a way to complete the rabbinic command, not divine command. Talk about erotic poetry. What are we doing?
I'm helping her.
Okay. Rashi says that we are, this is Rashi, not God saying this, says that we're commanded to recite 100 blessings a day. And he says that the best way to do that is to recite Psalms. That embedded in the text ends up being 100 blessings. So we use those Psalms as blessings, as poems, as liturgy, and all sorts of fun things. And so scholars have tried to categorize all of these different Psalms, and they've come up with a couple different categories. A Psalm of Thanksgiving, there are majesty or kingship Psalms. There's a couple Psalms that are written to Korach and his followers, who went to Moses and said, "Aren't we all just as special?" And then the earth ate them. But what we're going to look at is a couple different versions of lamenting Psalms, most of which are individual laments. But there are a couple community laments written from the we instead of from the I. And so we had last time 2 of those individual laments. Psalm 23, the shepherd psalm, God is my shepherd, I shall not weep. That's the old King James translation. And Psalm 27, only one thing do I ask of God, to live in God's house forever. You wouldn't think that those kinds of things that talk about trust and faith and the power of God are lamenting psalms, right? When we looked at it on Saturday, it didn't obviously jump out as a complaining session. Woe is me, I'm sick, I have no money, I have no house, everything is awful, right? It didn't necessarily sound like a lament. So what we're gonna do is look at 2 more, and we won't do quite as intense of a poetic analysis looking at metaphors, but just to see how the psalmist, whether it's David or some anonymous psalmist, what the psalmist did in order to communicate a lament, but also to communicate moving out of the lament. How does the psalmist kind of change the narrative? And what maybe tools or techniques are they using in order to change that narrative? Does that make sense? Great. Robin, is that a question or you're?
No.
Okay, cool.
Now the question.
Shelley.
Is this an I or a me, or is this a we?
Psalm 23.
It is technically an I. It's written in the first person singular.
I
We do tend to say it in communal situations, right, at funerals, during Yisker.
Yeah.
But the actual words are written in the singular, not in the plural.
So that anybody who reads this.
And be reading it for themselves. So let's look at Psalm 126, which is a community lament. There's one little, this isn't the regular translation that we get from JPS, like where we use the rest of our translations from. And Phyllis will attest, I was retyping this and
Where did that line come from? It's
right,
not-
the translator included an extra line of the psalm that doesn't show up in the Hebrew. I didn't have a chance to look up, maybe she was looking at a different version of the psalm. They've gone through so many different versions, even in translation. And so I included it, but you can see that there's no Hebrew on the other side because it's just made up, I think. But does someone want to read in English all of Psalm 126 for us?
Sure. A song of uplift. When the Redeemer returns the exiles to Zion, we will have been like dreamers. Then our mouths will overflow with laughter, our tongues with cries of joy. Then it will be said among the nations, God has acted with grandeur on behalf of these people. God will act with wonder toward us. The thought fills us with joy. Here comes the line. The Holy One has glorified us by name. We will be as though having been in the divine presence throughout. Return us, God, from our exile. Like sudden stream beds in the Negev, those who plant seeds with tears of sorrow will gather the harvest with songs of joy. The one who walks, even while weeping, lifting the seed as he goes, will return with gladness, carrying his sheaves of corn.
Excellent, thank you. So for anyone who knows Debbie Friedman music, you will recognize this psalm because you know, those who sow in tears will reap in joy, will reap in joy. And she wrote that to lead out of Mourner's Cottage. But question for all of you, do you consider this a lament?
Sure.
Great. What do you see in it that's lamentful,
Well, there's the first verse, once you get past the Song of Uplift, it's when.
When,
So first of all, when means you're in a condition that you're talking about but hasn't occurred yet. So when the Redeemer returns the exiles to Zion, well, right there, it's a lament because you're in exile. Zion is in exile. And that already is sad. We will have been like dreamer. Well, that's probably enough for now. But the interesting part is to me, that connects with your extra verse, right?
Great.
The Holy One is glorified as by we will be as though having been in the divine presence throughout. That is a way of coming out of the lament, because the greatest sadness is to not be in the presence of the divine.
Nice.
So that's really what is if you're in exile and God and all of these exiles, the rabbis and all that, there were reasons. God is saying, I'm using all these politics for my divine purposes. But he's thrown you into exile and you're away, you're on the banks of some strange place, and it's not a good thing.
Nice. Right. So maybe the lamenting part is the psalmist is currently in a lamentful experience, but writes from a place of hope, and even hoping to be able to look back on the experience and say, it actually, like God had never left me in that moment. They're looking to have the blessing of hindsight in that moment when they are able to be uplifted. Nice, great. You're working on something, Phyllis? You're thinking
Oh, I'm
something?
just
Okay.
thinking about what you're saying.
get out of my head.
In exile. I was born at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, and I've lived my whole life in Chicago. Am I in exile?
Well,
From Chicago?
From Zion.
Zion.
Oh,
well, and that's one of the things that shows up in Psalms a lot. You can read it as being a specific example, right? When the Israelites were exiled from the kingdom of Israel and they're laying on the other side of the river Jordan, and by the waters we wept, we blah, 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 which is its own community lament psalm too. And it can also be read filled with metaphor, right? Is Zion the promised land, or is Zion a place of comfort and safety? And right, what is it that the psalmist or even the reader of the psalm, how do we understand all of those words? It doesn't have to be the specific version, it can be the metaphoric version. And that's usually how our prayers lift them up as metaphors more than specific.
And it can be both at the same time.
Well, yes,
Because in the phrase, then it will be said among the nations, God has acted with grandeur on behalf of these people. That's a reference to God will deliver us and we will be exalted as a nation again when we come back out of exile. But it also means in another way, it will be, once we are reunited with God, we will be spiritually uplifted. And that's really the return to Zion, is the return to Zion in a spiritual way.
right? And so that word of return or renewal or it shows up a couple different times. And I'm just realizing that I hit return poorly on verse 6 here because there's just letters hanging in the middle of nowhere. But between the idea of return and uplift, those become very powerful metaphors for the psalmist that change depending on the reader's context every single time, right? It doesn't have to mean going up to Jerusalem and making a literal aliyah. It could be a spiritual aliyah. It could be an uplifting moment. It doesn't have to be a permanent change. It can be that word shuv, to return, is very much a cyclical return, right? It's not just go backwards to what was. It's let the cycle keep cycling, and understanding that not everything is going to be bright and shiny forever. We might need to come back to the psalm again and remind ourselves that
The Yom Kippur service.
yeah, and Yom Kippur service uses a lot of these, if not the specific lines, then a lot of these keywords.
Well, the concept, the whole concept.
Right, think the way we usually end our Kol Nidre services, return again, return to the land of your soul, right? Shuva Adonai,
Right.
return to God, or God return us, right? It could be, because Hebrew is not a verbose language, two words can be translated and interpreted in many different ways. So whoever is the direct object or the actor or can change, and it depends on the listeners or the translators' experience in that moment, how they choose to do that.
So what you said with the Yom Kippur service, it doesn't matter where you are when you do that service because you have returned to Zion by the continuity of the service
Yeah.
from year to year.
And
It's certainly the
Do
hope.
it again next year.
Yeah, but it's not a specific place then.
Right.
Zion is where you are and where the lament is.
Right, and Zion, especially in a time of diaspora, of Jews living throughout the world, really does become that spiritual homeland much more than the physical homeland. Now, we can talk about Zionism and all of that and really get off topic. But we often ask for a return to Zion, and even in our worship that we do here at Temple. And I don't know of anyone who's specifically asking for a return to the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when they say those words. They're asking for a moment of uplift and a moment of spiritual strength. Stuart, and then Chuck, did I see your hand up? No, great.
Well, the hint for
Just gonna
this
keep calling on people.
is back again in the first verse. When the Redeemer returns the exiles to Zion, we will have been like dreamers. So there's a hint in the phrase, we will have been like dreamers. There are two things that happen when you're dreaming. When you're a dreamer, you have to be asleep, number one. And sleep is often metaphorically linked to death.
said to be
So-
1/60th of death.
So when you're asleep, you are in part dead. And so then you get this contrast. When this thing occurs, there's going to be this dramatic change. You've been sleeping, you've been dreaming, you've been near death, and the death isn't necessarily physical death. It's number one, the death of spirit, and number two, perhaps the death, the disappointment of the very literal way of people who are in exile, who are wanting, who are in pain, who are suffering. But then you're going to have this tremendous contrast. What interests me though is all of this up here, even though our mouths will overflow, our tongues will have cries of joy. It all seems to be out of the control of the person saying the lament in this first part. But then you get a shift in the second part, one return, and then we're going to have activity. You'll plant seeds with tears of sorrow, we'll gather the harvest with songs of joy. Suddenly, it's not God doing it. The redemption has happened. So once redeemed, you are then roused from sleep and move into the field of action again.
Right, a different understanding of what resurrection could actually be, and that the mission of the one who sleeps in the dust then becomes planting seeds while you're down there, because that is what eventually grows and lifts you back up. Right, those who sow in tears, who water the ground with their own pain, will eventually reap a harvest that is no longer filled with pain, but reminds them of joy. So for this psalm, the change from lament to praise becomes that act of agriculture, right? Of planting and harvesting, and knowing that you might need to wait for something to grow. Tend to it, of course, but you can't make it happen overnight. Awesome. Other thoughts on this one?
Can't you dream while you're awake?
I mean, I certainly do.
I mean, really,
Yeah.
can't you, I mean, with everything that you said, but can't I'll do it with me. Can't I sit and dream the same things?
You mean
that I
daydream?
dreamed? Yeah, that I dream about at night. And maybe, I mean, I know I'm probably doing more of a control during the day.
For any biblical author at any time, the idea of dream is closely connected with the idea of a prophetic vision.
Oracular.
Halom and chazon become very closely linked, dream and vision. That to the point that, when Joseph dreams about the stars and the moon and everything bowing down to his son, right? That's his prophetic vision in a dream. Very few prophets get to hear their prophecy while they're awake. Mostly it's Moses who gets to do that. And when he dies, Torah tells us that and there never arose another prophet in Israel like Moses, because he had that particular skill. I think one of the reasons that dream and vision become so closely linked is it takes us out of the world that we're living in, even if we can still control the daydream a little bit. We're interacting with the world a lot less when we do that. And it becomes dream-like, even if it's not a sleeping dream. Right.
Have I?
Yes.
In verses 5 and 6, we go from plural to singular again. Last one is singular. Are we to infer something from that even though there's not a capital in the one, that we could be switching back to the Redeemer, the one who walks even while weeping and ascribing anthropomorphically a sadness to God.
Like God is the one who's walking and
and
weeping?
that we're the sheaves of corn.
Sure.
You can do anything you want.
It's poetry, like, whatever works.
I'm just curious as about the shift, because it's, you know, those who plant seeds with tears of joy will gather, but then the one who walks, it just seems, you know, unusual that you would just switch it.
Right, so there really isn't any subject in this verse. There's no when the farmer plants, when God plants. It's a missing subject. So it could be, it's a very valid interpretation that it could be God who sows with tears and then reaps with joy, just as much as a person would. Yeah. Cool. Let's do Psalm 140. I can bet that none of you have read this because it doesn't show up very often in our rituals at all. But it uses, I like it because it uses a special word, the word Selah, which if you ever met, Cantor Amy and her choir, she calls them the Selah choir. Selah is a word that's a lot like hallelujah. You actually cannot translate it. It's just a praiseful word. And we have it a couple times in our prayers, but it gets used a lot in Psalms. It's almost like the psalmist going to themselves and saying, Amen, I'm right. And it becomes a emotional exclamation. So it's why I picked this one. And as someone is about to volunteer to read it, look at how that word is used to balance out what comes before it. All right, so you'll see what I mean. Anyone feeling poetic and brave? Can read nice and dramatically?
I'll try.
Go for it.
For the conductor of the Internal Symphony, a psalm by David. Release me, God, from the heedless.
Oh, from the Heartless, sorry.
I was wondering what that word meant. Release me, God, from the heartless, from those of violence. Keep vigilant watch. Those who scheme malice in the hearts, every day they stir up wars. They have sharpened their tongues like a snake. A viper's poison trickles on their lips. Selah. Protect me, God, from the unkind. From those of violence, keep vigilant watch. Those who intended to make me stumble. The haughty buried a snare for me, ropes to make me fall. They spread out a net along the ditch. They set traps for my feet. Selah. I said to God, you are the wellspring of my strength. Open your ears, Holy One, to my cry. God, my upholder, you are the strength behind my salvation. You cover my head with comfort on the day when bloodshed strikes. Don't give in, my upholder, to the wishes of the wrongful. Don't let their scheming come to pass. They will think themselves higher than you. Selah. The heads of those who come intending harm, let the dirt of their own lips cover them. Let blazing coals hail down, making them stumble into fire, into floods, leaving them unable to rise. A person with hateful tongue will never be at peace in the land. Those of violence, their own evil will hunt them down, thrust upon thrust. I know what God will do. You stand up for the afflicted, bringing down judgment on behalf of the poor. Only the righteous are grateful for your name. Only the honest can dwell in your presence.
Thank you. So how does the word Selah function here?
It's magical. Functions in a sense of magic to avert
Right, so bad things are happening. Let's say Sela as a abracadabra kind of word. It changes things. Okay. Other thoughts? Continuing thoughts?
Off the topic of Sela,
Great.
I don't know what honest has to do with it. Only the honest can dwell in your presence. I don't understand that.
So that's the translator's word, honest. It comes from the word straight, yashar. Some people would translate that as upright, but the translator used kind of upright and upholder in different ways.
Not devious.
Not devious, only the true can dwell in your presence. So it's an a translator's choice to use that word, honest.
So there's
I'm-
no,
Okay.
so there's no place in God's parameter heart for people who do evil? Is that what he's really saying?
Well, at least the way I read this, and I'm looking up to make sure that I'm not gonna tell you something wrong, is that the first half of this is badness, 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 right? But I almost read the second part as a curse, right? All y'all are bad, may bad things happen to you. But me, I'm not bad, right? This is only the righteous are grateful, only the honest can dwell, right? That's the psalmist saying that they're one of those people, and that God acts on behalf of them. If God curses the bad, it will because the psalmist asked for it, because the psalmist wanted magic. And
So I guess I struggle because there's good and bad in all of us. And so I struggle with this. There's no one that is, well, I can't make that kind of general statement, but so I just struggle with the isolation.
yeah, certainly the psalmist seems angry and vengeful,
So angry and vengeful.
right? Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm interpreting Sela a little differently. I'm seeing it as, and so it is, like it's underlined 3 times what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Right, and right, a viper's poison trickles on their lips. Yep, that's right. They set traps for me at my feet. Yep, that's right. They think themselves higher than you. Yep, I have evidence to prove that. Right, could also very well be that. I also read it almost as Sela is the way that the psalmist keeps themselves from getting trapped in the badness. Right, they use the metaphor here of being trapped like a animal in a snare with ropes. That it's one of the ways that the psalmist is reminding themselves, don't let yourself sink too deeply into hate. Lift yourself back up before you remind yourself of the awful, right? Take a break from the news and then go back to it. And there's lots of different ways to translate an untranslatable word. So it could mean anything. It could mean God do the magic that I'm asking for. It could mean the psalmist is feeling particularly superior and uses this word to kind of prove their superiority against the jackasses that surround them. It could be a way of kind of affirming their own statement, right? We don't usually say amen to our own prayers because in theory you don't need to agree with yourself, but maybe the psalmist feels the need to kind of double down on those things. Do you see this as a lament? Oh, Alon has thoughts.
It's just so angry.
It is angry, yeah.
I mean, to me, it's almost beyond a lament. You know, it's just to another phase, another, you know, so, I don't know.
Okay, so maybe lament is a little more sad and pathetic than this is. I don't know what else to, it's a little bit more like Eeyore, and a little bit less like,
Yeah, but
like wrestling. I don't know.
it's almost like a warning. If you do all these things, I know what God will do. I know what God will do to you, but you can stand up. I'll stand up for the afflicted, bringing down judgment on the head. So it's almost like a yin and yang thing.
Right, you can decide whether to be a viper or whether to be honest. You can decide whether to spread traps for the innocent, or you can be a righteous person.
And yet, even though cutting the stuff is the majority of this, the last part is really, I think, more powerful than
It's very hopeful. I'm
Yeah.
Yadati, I know, and okay, this is the translator adding extra words. Yadati, I know. Ki asa Adonai, what God will do. Din ani mishpat avonim, will judge for the poor. Well, Din is like the judgmental side of God. The not judgmental like why are you wearing those ripped jeans kind of thing, but judgmental like a judge, like a court. And it's almost like the poor are the ones who are judging in the way that the sentence is structured. The poor will judge judgments on my enemies, on the enemies. So it's a very terse statement here, right? It's very short in Hebrew that the translator adds a lot more words, so kind of softens the blow a little bit in the English, in my perspective. Yeah, Stuart.
I think Alon is right. I think this is a very troubling text. And it's troubling, it seems to me, because it's talking about the nature of evil. And the nature of evil in Judaism, it's a difficult thing to talk about because Judaism is a religion of ethical monotheism. And so where does that evil come from? What is the source of that evil, and what is in fact real evil? Is real evil the kinds of things that we've come up with in society? That is to say, someone murders, that's evil. Someone steals my purse, that's evil. Are those the things that we judge to be evil? Or is there something that isn't surrounded by something that says, this is evil? Now, I think here, it's telling you what evil is. Believe it or not, I think it's in verse 9. Don't let their scheming come to pass. They will think themselves higher than you. The notion that you will overturn God's plan. You will think that you will believe that you can overturn the natural order of things as set in motion by God on high. That's what evil is, that stones could swell or flowers dance like in the cartoons would be so truly horrifyingly evil versus somebody picking your pocket or running a red light or even doing, even starting a war or something like that. But it just seems to me that that's what this is hinting at. And then it comes back kind of down to earth, if you will, in this last verse saying what either the poor will get to judge, but it also affirms that Judaism or the Israelites, however you want to call them, were the first people that actually put in measures for the poor, had
Right,
things set
tithes and
aside, tithes and things, and they were the wonder of the ancient world, including ancient Rome, for doing it.
And I think that evilness is so embedded in metaphor here, right? They're not actually saying that evil looks like murder and lying and war. Right? Evil looks like a sharpened tongue and a comparison to a couple different animals, and like a hunter going out for an innocent creature, right? And I think as you mentioned, Judaism is ethical monotheism, that we kind of go between, are people evil or are actions evil? And what becomes fascinating in most of the Psalms is the Psalms would really say that the people are evil because of how they refer to people. The evil ones, the haters, the ones who break your laws, right? Those are, it refers to them as if that's their title. But then it goes farther and says the evil ones do these evils, right? You almost have to have both. An evil soul and an evil action equals evil, true evil.
True malignancy, yeah.
And so you can't just, when it's in a metaphor, it becomes a little easier to express that way. So you don't have to explain yourself quite as much.
But it also provides some kind of balance as where there's activity here that, what was that reading it? It talks about the fact that you let people poison themselves with their own words.
Mm-hmm.
And you just, you don't have to intervene or do anything, but that goodness will prevail. It kind of like is there. You have to dig for it, but it's there.
Right, like if you let them go poison themselves, then they'll eventually die off and only the good people will be left. Phyllis, were you gonna say something too?
Verse 7 was a little troubling to me because it's almost like calling God out and saying, aren't you paying attention here?
Yeah. And
And it's almost like putting himself above God by doing that.
and anthropomorphizes God, right? That God has ears to open. That make God feel a little bit closer, right? The more we understand God as a person, we limit God, but we understand God.
And God can't pay attention all the time. I mean, like in one of the prayers that we have on due Saturday morning, to keep asking, is God really available to hear everybody in the world's prayer?
And that is
the essence of the.
It's a
of the quote.
particularly
Yeah.
post-Holocaust theology, that God can ever only be two of three things: all present, all good, and present and knowing are the same, all good and all capable. So if God can only ever be two of those things at a time, maybe God is an all-knowing, either by God's choice or not. So even if God is good, maybe God doesn't hear the prayers.
It's a lot of prayers to hear.
Yeah. Phyllis and then Alon.
Maybe it's pointing out that God is more tolerant of people being imperfect and doing horrible things and accepting that they have to run their course to get to a different place. Where this person who is lamenting over, they should be better and doesn't have the patience to figure that people have an opportunity to return or to do better given
Right.
time.
The person is living in the difficulty. It's a lot harder to see the forest for the trees when you're in the middle of the forest. And you know, wants to not be the only one suffering. But God is a little bit more removed. Perhaps can see the bigger picture. And the psalmist is like, that's not fair. Why do I have to be the one who suffers and goes through it when you get to go, you know, sit on your fluffy little cloud and just watch it all happen? That's not actually my theology, but yes.
It's a good theology.
Well, no, I think that's presented here.
Yeah, it's right. It's angry and vengeful, but it's also a little like, this isn't fair. Why is this happening to me when everyone around seemed to be just fine? They get to be the ones who entrap me, and I'm the one who has to feel like, you know, I'm hunted and you know, and suffering through life. On.
So the way we're talking about it makes God feel external to oneself.
Mm-hmm.
That God is out there someplace. You know, he can't be all, God can't be can't hear everybody at the same time. But I have a really hard time with that concept because I like to believe that God is within us. And that we have the capability of affecting our environment, and I don't just mean outside our environment, but affecting our lives and other people's lives. And the more I read Torah on Saturdays, the more I feel that God has so many flaws that it's true. I mean, some of the things that we read about, you know, creating these wars and making this person suffer. And so I don't know how to reconcile that, but I don't believe that God is external. You know, to me, God has to be internal too.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And one of my favorite modern biblical theology, someone from now looking back at the Bible and saying, this is what God meant back then, is that the book of Genesis, when God does a lot of screwing up, makes a lot of promises and then kills a lot of people and then makes more promises and then kills a lot of people, is really God's childhood. God figuring out how to be God and stumbling and in like kind of wandering around like a toddler and bouncing off of things, and trying to figure out how to do the God thing. Certainly, whether you're talking Torah or the larger Bible or even now, think it becomes a very valid theology that God is imperfect because the world is imperfect.
Given Ukraine and the Supreme Court and
Yes.
the crazies that we have, I think he's still in his childhood.
Yeah, and that's also a very non-traditional theology, because traditionalists would say that the reason we study Torah, the reason we study the Hebrew Bible, is because the text was written and given by a perfect being, and because we are imperfect, we struggle to understand. Therefore, we must study and study and study. So it puts a lot more burden on us than it does on God. And it right, you talk to 3 Jews, you're going to come up with 18 different opinions. And some of those are very personal, very theological, very, if you challenge me, I'm not going to like it. In stances on what God and the meaning of life are, right? I don't have an answer. I have a lot of questions.
But this really is very current in terms of saying these are the heartless and the cruel, and then these are the things that you can do that balance that off and be trust that things will get better.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat descriptive of it.
It's hopeful.
Unfortunately.
It's still a little relevant.
Yeah.
So
In our in the various versions and the various authors that are in the Torah, you get different images of God.
Mm-hmm.
And God is used in different ways. You have, this very, very heartless image of God. When in some versions, in some passages of Torah, when the Israelites are coming into the land and just slaughtering
Everybody,
and slaughtering and slaughtering.
and the children.
But then you have versions of the Exodus in which God is this deliverer of the oppressed. And the notion of God as the deliverer of the oppressed is translated in ancient Israel into the need to help the poor and all of this kind of thing. So it's, a lot of it is poetry and metaphor, and depending on who you are and how you read it, it can influence you in how you think and how you behave.
And at any point in your life, you could go back to the exact same text and read it completely differently, right? That is the entire reason we read one book over and over every year for our entire lives, because the text might not change, but we change. And so our understanding of the text changes.
Or you find new meanings.
Exactly. So speaking of finding meaning, each of you had a homework assignment to perhaps think of a difficult moment in your life and consider what metaphor you might have used for yourself that helps you be with that difficult moment, either in memory or in when you were actually in it. So what I'd like for us to do is share those metaphors. If you want to share the story, you can. You don't have to. But to share, what the metaphor means, right? As the metaphor of the path in the dark woods, a meaning of journey and not knowing where you're going, right? It doesn't have to be the story. I'm not going to force you to tell deep, dark secrets to each other. Okay, great. Someone want to go first? Hold on.
So when you told me about the assignment this afternoon, I took it more holistically, not one particular event, okay? And I use this for myself, and I use it for people who I see who have had traumas. And I see life as a patchwork quilt with pieces, with our life events, pieces, putting together to form a whole quilt. And when something happens that is traumatic, I have a visual. When something happens that is traumatic, the piece that I put in is bright and pronounced and taking over. But then as life goes on, it begins to fade into the quilt. But not necessarily entirely, because sometimes if you've had a trauma or you've had an event, something can trigger it. So there's still the boundary that exists. But hopefully, again, as life goes on, the piece is part of our lives, but it becomes much more integrated into our lives. It's changed us just as it would change a quilt. It's made it different. And so that's how I try and look at life during my better times. So nothing specific.
Thank you. Great, thank you.
That was beautiful.
I did use this. I did use this with some of the people who I saw the other day, who were part of the shooting in Highland Park. And I think the visual really is helpful, in terms of trying to incorporate it into life and just waiting for it to settle down as much as it can be. So.
Still a very bright
Very bright,
patch right now.
very bright.
Someone else want to give it a shot? Yeah, go for it.
About a year ago, I had a real bad health scare. And as a nurse myself, it really threw me over the edge. So I wrote something that to help me through this health scare. Life is a journey. Sometimes you take too much or grab too little. Too much can be a bad thing. Too little can be a bad thing. But your health is the most important. Look for moderation and your well-being.
Nice. I like that. It sounds a lot like you gotta be able to carry your backpack.
Uh-huh.
Not too much, not too little. Enough to take care of you, not enough to overwhelm you. Thank you.
I couldn't come up with a metaphor, but I wrote the story. And Psalm 126, I think, covers the metaphor. So I'll read my story. We had just returned from a wonderful trip to Israel, and through my jet lag, I ventured to visit my 91-year-old mother at her nursing home to see her, find out how she was doing, and to share photos of our trip. I went through the ones on my phone, remembering where and what I saw for some, and already starting to forget others. She was glad to see me, interested as much as anyone in the photos, and just pleased I was there with her. I looked up and realized she was late for lunch. I brought her to the dining room, thinking I would finish my photo tour the next day. I left prying my eyelids open and carefully drove back home. It was Halloween, and in the middle of the night, a phone call woke me up from a dense sleep. It was the nursing home informing me that my mother was not breathing, and with her DNR was gone. So to have that extra hour during lunch to be with her, I was totally shocked and taken off guard. Such a wonderful trip, ending with the loss of a wonderful mom. As I recovered from the funeral, family visits, and settling the paperwork, I was repeatedly told that my mother waited for me before she took her last breath. From the shadow to a different type of hope, I emerged.
Beautiful, thank you. It's a lot of power in just showing someone some photos from a trip. It's a really strong memory. Thank you.
I wrote a real dark thing, and then I decided not to go that way. So I just condensed it into a little, this is what is on my mind lately. We are on a moving sidewalk. It brings us to choices. We can get off on the right or the left. What if we're unhappy with the choice? Is there a reverse shuttle?
Good.
I'm imagining a really long airport terminal right now
Yeah,
and all the gates.
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna put an elevator in there, but I was like, no, I gotta figure out how to get back, and if we go up, that would be too complicated.
Thank you. A moving sidewalk. I can experience those a little bit differently now.
Careful which way you get off.
Anyone else want to give it a shot? You don't have to if you don't want to.
Can't move
Yeah,
right.
Chuck?
Maybe I didn't understand the assignment because I just wrote something rather short, but I was waiting in a room while a loved one was having surgery. And I thought that was like living in a slow motion existence. You know, that time that I was waiting, it just seemed to go, maybe it was an hour and a half or 2 hour procedure, but it seemed to last forever.
Yeah. I think we can all relate to that.
That slow motion existence.
I was just thinking what you just said on that moving sidewalk. If you've got luggage, do you let it go? Let it come with you. If it's luggage you want to get rid of, if it's,
That's another way.
I mean, I just.
It's yours, you just bought it.
One way or another, the luggage
Run with it.
complicates the
Well, you know
journey.
what's in the luggage.
Yeah.
So it's, I mean, that's one way of getting rid of some really bad stuff.
That you can
Yeah,
lift.
just let go of the one.
It's all of that.
So,
Carry it.
I completely understand how hard it is to try to come up with these and to, one, trust all of us to hear that. And I want to thank you for being brave and being honest in hearing your metaphors and your stories. But also to do that reflecting back on really difficult moments. I think that, as we read Psalms, most of them are written in the present tense, but they have a really strong feeling of hindsight, looking back on a difficult moment, looking back on a praiseful moment, looking back and saying, this is how I understand that moment. And what I have for us is a couple different textual, that kind of intertextual citations that show up often in our prayers and often in Psalms. It says a few because I would need to create an entirely new prayer book to include all of them. But what I'd like for us to try to do is take a couple minutes, and you have some writing paper behind if you'd like that, to take that metaphor and connect it with another piece of our text, with another piece of our tradition. And whether most of these, at least to me, I read them as relatively hopeful pieces, but to see if there's maybe your favorite verse of something or a part of our prayer service or something that helps you connect that moment to a bigger picture, to maybe the Jewish tradition. And see if you can or are inclined to include that other piece of text in the one that you've started creating, or that other piece of text style that you've started creating. Your face tells me I haven't explained it well.
I'm not sure I get it.
Okay.
But I think I have to read what
Can you
the
give
prompts
us
are.
an example?
Yeah, so
Yeah, I was gonna ask, did you write one?
well, I didn't have a specific moment that I was thinking of. But anyone who knows me knows that I love puzzles. I love putting pieces together and finding the perfect way that they fit. But I also like it when they don't fit because it tells me what shouldn't be there. So to me, puzzle was the metaphor for difficulty. Is, keep trying it out, keep working with it. Eventually you'll find the right piece. And to me, let's see, I didn't think to go as far as to pick this one thing. Okay. So difficulty is like a puzzle to me. I spent a lot of my time trying to find the right piece, and often I find the wrong piece. But when I do find, because there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, right? It's a percentage game. But when I find that right piece, it is so satisfying that I want to go tell people about it. I'm very excited when I find just the right piece, and I feel like I get to take a deep breath. So it makes me think of this verse. It's on page 4, Psalm 84:5. Happy are those who dwell in your house; they forever praise you, Selah. Right? When the house is finally built, when all the pieces are in place, I find my joy. Does that make a little bit more sense? Okay. So we'll take, I know, it can be a lot. It doesn't have to be from something on this page too. If you have something else that you're thinking of that you want to try to connect, go crazy. I have pens if anyone needs.
I need that bright colored square.
Don't force it if it's not coming. Take another minute. The timed version of psalm writing. Sorry, Stuart. Okay. I know I asked you to do a big task in not a lot of time. And not everyone feels inspired in the moment to write a thing or to create the 151st Psalm. But it could be a beginning of something. Does anyone want to share what they were working on?
I didn't write a psalm.
You
That's
wrote
for
a
sure.
book.
No, I just Well,
meandering.
anytime you put a verse from Job in front of me, I go off. And so,
A little bit like
because,
Job.
Yeah.
A little bit like
a
Job.
little bit like
Yeah.
Job, because, I return to this story over and over again. And mostly I return to it because the conclusion is so unsatisfying. You know, we all know the story of Job, and all of his so-called friends he has to deal with, and the loss of his family. And then, of course, everything coming back to him and all. But the difficulty with Job, and it begins to remind me a lot like Psalm 140 that we just read, is that when Job finally screws up his courage and says, wait a minute, God, wait a minute. No, I need something more, some kind of explanation. God basically tells him, shut up, Job. That is really the answer. Can you hook the Leviathan by the mouth? Can you make the winds blow? Can you do all these things? And God's answer is essentially, I am unlike an anthropomorphic God, even though he describes all these things that are basically anthropomorphic. God's basic answer is I am so wholly other than you, you cannot begin to imagine what I am. So stop trying. That's his answer. So it is a psalm of lament, because I've been trying, you work on answering that question all the time. And so this business of return of ye to Zion and know thee and I will be fulfilled. Nope, not yet.
Yeah. So the lament of the eternal question.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts? Did you know that we use all these psalms and all these quotes in our prayers? This is just from one section of a morning prayer service. So we use a lot of quotes and inspirations from psalms and from prophets and from various parts of the Torah in our prayers, in our liturgy. So I just wanted to encourage you to think of the Psalms, maybe not as something as foreign as you might have an hour and a half ago, but that even though the book of Psalms is over, is done and complete and codified, the practice of Psalms is never over. We use it all the time, and we are often creating our own psalmage that helps us to understand both the good and the bad, the holy and the mundane, the everyday experiences of what it means to be a human being who has human thoughts and human inclinations. That's what Psalm is. It's our book. It's the human book in a very divinely inspired text. And I wasn't intending on this, but Phyllis, you made me think about my experience with this Ashrae piece, Happy Are Those Who Dwell in Your House. And once upon a time, it's like 8 or 9 years ago at this point, I'm just figuring out how to write prayer poetry. Like, we have a class in it. I didn't really pay attention. But we had a retreat in rabbinical school that a friend asked me to introduce the Prayer of Ashrae, which is a poem. It's a combination of a couple different psalms. It's an acrostic. It's an intention setting for a day and a prayer practice. And I looked at this very first verse, happy are those who dwell in your house, they will forever praise you. And I was just supposed to introduce it, but of course I rarely take direction. And so I wrote my own version of what that line really means from God's perspective. So I wouldn't call this a lamenting psalm, but this is, what you all inspired me to remember in this moment. When I built my house, I built it from scratch. I put every piece into place myself. I planted the garden, I tended it and watered it. I made sure every leaf, petal, and stem grew. I painted the walls, chose every color of every mural and every statue. I put up stone walls and wooden structures. I made sure every wavelength of light was reflected on the multitude of surfaces. I built my house from scratch, and now I welcome you into it. I offer you a refreshing drink of spring water. I open the window so that you may sit near this cool breeze. Take comfort and joy in the house I have built, for I built it just for you. I built it so that every hall and corner you may discover something new, to see with new wonderment everywhere you turn. I built it to provide for every piece of your life, so that you may work, but I pray never lack. I built it with puzzles, so that you can take apart and reconfigure, so that you too may build my house. Because when I built my house, I built it from scratch, and I did it all alone. But when I built my house, I built it for you, so that you might build our house too.
That's beautiful.
So Psalms don't have to stop. And they can be lamentable, and they can be hopeful, and they can be thankful, and they can be all the different fulls that we have in our life. And maybe you'll find a new place for Psalms in your life. So thank you for learning with me. And
Thank you for that.
okay.
Thank you.
I'm blanking on the next thing. Oh, if you're interested in learning about how not to play baseball, you can go to the Chicago Dogs baseball game next week. Or just come to services, spend some time with us.
Friday night.
Friday night services.
Saturday
People are
morning.
going out.
We are gonna try to do another Shabbat dinner with friends at Landmark Inn in downtown Northbrook. A couple people have gotten text from me about it, but anyone is welcome to join. Just let me know so that I can tell them how many of us to expect. There are outdoor seats, and right now the weather report says it's gonna be really nice out. So we'll see.
Would you be willing to share that with us?
Sure. Sure.
Would you be willing to email it or?
Copy. I'll put it in an
My
email.
sister.
Great. I'll send it.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of your evening. It's still light outside, Shelley.
I know,
I did that just for you.
Oh, thank you.
So
I'm looking.
wonderful.